So in most crises, you're forgiven for breaking some of the rules. In the overdose crisis, those rules happen to be the law, right? So the topic of my discussion is about service design in a time of the opioid crisis, but I think more broadly, it's really about how to design against power and the institutions that wield it. So as some context, this, you can't help but be moved by the stats when you look at this. How many people here remember SARS or have heard of SARS, right? So SARS happened in 2003 and 44 deaths, Hong Kong, Toronto, and it pretty much shut down the city of Toronto for quite a period. Nothing was really going in or out, a lot of quarantine happening. The Rolling Stones actually felt sorry for Toronto and had a benefit concert in one of our big open parks to bring tourism back into the city. That was 2003, 44 deaths. Since that time, 10,000 lives have been lost in this province of Ontario, which is the province where Toronto belongs, due to this opioid crisis. And the real tragedy here is really the failure of our institutions to do something about this. So if drugs are bad, why are people still doing it, right? And I'm sorry for using this design squiggle kind of upside down for a different purpose, but I think it serves this topic well. So if drugs are bad, why are people doing it? One way to think about this, and the overall kind of narrative that's been put out there is that big pharma is really behind overprescribing of opioids to patients, and then they get hooked, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's only one part of the story. The real story, I think, goes back to what Jusina was talking about, really about the social structures of society and of our cities. And so within that context, I think it helps us understand why the crisis is happening. And it's a pretty complex milieu of all kinds of things happening all at once. The biggest driver is really poverty. When people are growing up in those situations where they need to find a way to escape their social circumstances or the sense of hopelessness, that's really where I think drugs and turning to substance use becomes quite common. There are people who use because of childhood trauma, right? Intergenerational trauma. I think Jesse Wenty talked about this. A lot of drug and criminalization happens among indigenous people, right? And so those intergenerational traumas, colonization, and all of those things don't go away that quickly. And so I guess the overall picture here is that it's quite complex. And to say to people, well, this stuff is bad, stop using, why can't you just stop using? That's not really going to solve the problem. In fact, many government policies have tried to do that. The war on drug is an example of that, where you throw people in prison, right? And you try to actually use law enforcement as a way to address this problem, but it hasn't gone away for many of those reasons I just talked about. So really what the solution here, I think, is what a lot of the harm reduction advocates have been saying for a long time, which is there are many reasons for why people engage in risky behavior, and to preach abstinence isn't going to solve the problem. What we need to do is find a way to reduce harm, i.e. harm reduction. And a clear example of this is the widespread distribution of condoms during the HIV/AIDS epidemic back in the 80s, right? People are going to engage in risky behavior anyways. Let's find a way to keep them safe. And the parallel to that, today, within the opioid crisis, I'm going to talk about two projects that I'm quite close to. The first is around this idea of safe injection services or safe injection sites as places people can go and use in a safe, supervised kind of way. And then the second is about giving people some information around the kinds of things that they're taking. There's a lot of stuff being mixed in, fentanyl being the biggest culprit, that people aren't fully aware of when they're taking a substance. So providing drug checking services is another example of harm reduction. So this is a service design blueprint framework. I think a lot of us here are quite familiar with it. There's stuff on the front stage, and then there's stuff in the backstage, and all of the interaction with the clients are on the front stage, and then all the processes behind the scenes are in the backstage. This is the front stage for safe injection services. It's in your neighborhood, right in front of you, right? So this is a bunch of activists in Toronto started the very first safe injection site in Toronto, completely illegal, unsanctioned. There was a lot of deaths in Moss Park, which is kind of Toronto's version of Vancouver's downtown east side or LA's Skid Row. A lot of deaths happening there, and these individuals decided one day back in August in 2017 just to set up a tent and have harm reduction workers and supplies and oxygen and naloxone, which is the antidote, right there on site to allow people to use in a safe way. Completely illegal. The police was giving them a lot of problems, et cetera, because they're violating, obviously, drug laws in the country. This picture is actually the second site that they set up in another part of the city called Parkdale, almost as prevalent in terms of overdoses as Moss Park. And it's right there in the neighborhood, so it puts harm reduction and the crisis up against the politics of neighborhoods and NIMBYism. This is right in somebody's front yard. And so these are some of the challenges, I think, around how to deal with the opioid crisis when you consider it within the broader context of society. The RAND Corporate, so sites like this, there's about 50 of them in Canada right now. That sounds like a lot, but that's not nearly enough to deal with the crisis. So in the States, in the US, 50,000 Americans die each year from the crisis. So that's more than all the American GIs that died during the Vietnam War in a year, right? And that continues to escalate. And the RAND Corporation, which is a think tank in the States, pretty much said that if we were to implement safe injection sites in the States, we would need 7,000 sites to really provide the service that we need to keep people safe. Canada is about a tenth of that. We have about 5,000 deaths as a country as a whole. You need about 700 sites, right? We're at 50. There's no way we can reach those numbers using current approaches when on top of that you have the politics of neighborhoods, et cetera, to deal with. At the same time, and I think partially driven by the fact that we don't have enough safe injection services, a lot of people use alone because of the lack of services, but also because of stigma and a variety of other issues. Some recent data from Ontario and BC, more than 50% of those deaths occur because people were completely alone at time of use. And so, no wonder the activist community has really been the driving force behind naloxone distribution, which is the antidote that you can apply during an overdose and reverse the overdose, as well as safe injection sites like this. So back in 2017, my lab, UHN OpenLab, said, man, this is a huge problem. And we're an innovation center. We have a lot of skills. Let's try to jump in here and maybe help out and try to do something about this. Without ever realizing that, and I actually made a lot of phone calls, sent a lot of emails around to the activists and to others. No one wanted to talk to us or to me. I think partially because my institution, UHN, it's the largest research hospital in Canada. We have revenues on the same order as the GDP of the island of Grenada. I mean, it's a massive, wealthy organization. Who the hell are we in terms of building the trust and having the relationships with this kind of a community to actually work in tandem with them to solve this issue? So one of the very first things that I did in terms of trying to uncover doing that first part of the double diamond, trying to explore and come to some idea of the kind of precision around the problem that we want to solve, we had to look beyond going into the community because they weren't talking to us. So I ended up contacting the Toronto police. So whenever there's an overdose and a death, we realized that the police officer that arrives at the scene has to take these copious notes of what actually happened. And so we thought, man, that's like a treasure trove. These are like the field notes of ethnographers, except they're written by the police officers. And so I asked for a bunch of these notes, and they wouldn't give them to us. And they said, pretty much, you have to do a freedom of information submission. In Canada, you can do that for public records. So we did an FOI submission, and they gave us 2,200 pages worth of police notes within that 1 year previously. So we combed through all of these notes to try to understand what was it that was driving, or what was happening at the front lines and at the scenes. And some of the notes, I think, pointed to this power structure that was at play. A lot of the officers would write, we arrived at the scene and whoever made the phone call escaped through the back door or jumped out the balcony because they were deathly afraid of the police and the institutions that are supposedly there to really protect them. And so this power dynamics began to kind of feel like something that was quite challenging for us. And so we turned to kind of the tenets of participatory design in the Scandinavian sense to say, can we find a way to involve the people who are most affected by whatever solution we come up with in the process? And part of that ethos of Scandinavian participatory design is how do you close the power distance between, so PD came, some of you in the room here might have a longer history around this than me, but PD came from this tradition that employers back in the 70s in Scandinavia were implementing information systems into the workplace without involving the workers in that process. And who ended up being the users of these systems? The workers. So the unions at the time kind of said, well, if you're going to design anything that affects us, we need to be involved in it. We need to shrink that power distance. It needs to be a shared power structure if we're going to actually do something productive out of this. So that was kind of the approach that we took with this project, but it wasn't easy. So that first tent that was set up in Moss Park, when the winter came, it moved into a trailer in the park. And so I spent a lot of nights in that trailer, just going to other parts of town, just getting to know people, and really shed my suit and like everything else that came along, all this baggage that came along with power and privilege and the institutions that I represent, and try to kind of build that connection in a kind of disempowered kind of way. And really through that process, developed some trust with the community and was able then to bring them on board and try to work with them to really think through how to solve this. And I don't have a lot of photos actually from our design sessions, et cetera, but believe me, we worked with around 100 people. These are people who use drugs and the harm reduction workers, and kind of out of respect for them and not to further stigmatize them, we did not take any photographs of any of the work that we did together through these workshops and various engagement exercises. But in the end, the space that we arrived at that really needed our design help was how do we take something that works really well, the safe injection site. It's been proven. It was published in The Lancet that the very first site in Canada in Vancouver, Insight, actually had produced massive reductions in harm within the downtown east side compared to the rest of the city. We kind of asked ourselves, well, how do we actually take that concept and make it more widely available, knowing that, first of all, there's huge investments in naloxone, which is the antidote. You can pick it up now in Canada at any drugstore. I have one in my bag right there. It's everywhere. The problem is, chances are that will never get used before it's expired. So they've invested massive amounts, the government has, in these things that probably would never get used. In fact, my neighbor in the apartment next door 2 months ago died of an opioid overdose, and I didn't know about it until 2 days later when the body was reeled out of the apartment. Meanwhile, I had naloxone sitting in my apartment. I was probably watching Netflix or something while this poor person was just, overdosing and struggling for air. And so So how do we actually take advantage of this resource that's already out there and make it available on a timely basis when somebody is overdosing? That was really the challenge. And we work with the community to develop, to use technology actually to make that happen. And so basically the way it works is before you use, you would hit this button on your phone, and there'll be a timer set at 2 minutes that will count down to 0. And if you don't physically turn off the alarm, like your morning alarm, it will assume that you're overdosing, and it'll send a signal out to the people in your network who have naloxone to come to the scene of the overdose and administer. So that was really the concept that took 2 years to actually come to in a very simplified kind of way. And there's a lot of complexities in this in terms of privacy. This is Bluebird. No one has to give their real name, et cetera. So all of it is trying to protect this community from unwanted access and privacy issues. So yeah, if somebody overdoses, this is the message you would see, kind of like an Amber Alert on your phone. One of the breakthroughs, actually, the initial conception of this was we had all these harm reduction programs throughout the city. They all have their workers. So the original conception was, why don't we round up all of these people and create an army of informal first responders that will respond. And when we took this initial idea to one of the women's shelters, the women were like, when I'm overdosing as a female, that's when I'm most vulnerable. I don't want some stranger to come and, even in a life and death situation, be in a position to be taken advantage of. And that, among other things, kind of said to us, including the fact that the harm reduction community is completely overstretched. I mean, they are barely paid enough. There's no more time in their day to actually do anything else besides what they're set out to do. And so that completely meant that we had to tear down everything that we're doing to that point and restructure the way this is going to work. So it became a peer-to-peer app. Forget the army. We realized a lot of people in these high-risk buildings know each other. So only if we can get them to build a social network through this app and kind of come to each other's aid, kind of neighbor-to-neighbor kind of thing. And that became the ultimate model that is now at the core of this work. And we're about to launch this in several high-risk buildings in downtown Toronto, starting in January 2020. We have now one of the major mobile phone carriers has agreed to give us hundreds of phones in the case of people who actually want to be involved but can't afford the plan or the phone. We're going to have that available to them. So really exciting point now to really push this out, starting in Toronto and then hopefully beyond. How am I doing on time, guys? Okay, cool. So the other project I want to talk about is drug checking. So this is actually not my project, but project of a group that I work very closely with, and a friend of mine, Karen McDonald, is really leading this project right there for the Center on Drug Policy Evaluation. They actually just launched this a week ago in Toronto. It's a drug checking service, and the way it works is, like I said before, one of the challenges is people don't know what they're taking. So there was a study in BC where they took 900 street samples of drugs being sold as heroin, and it turns out only 18% of these samples contain heroin. The rest was fentanyl, which is an analog with, massively more powerful effects. And these drug dealers don't have the proper machinery to mix this stuff, so you have hotspots. So you end up with a batch that could kill you because it's so potent. And so the drug checking service is supposed to allow people the opportunity to test their sample, either before they use or in a post-use paraphernalia kind of way. They can bring in their syringes, et cetera. And the way it works is you have the client, the harm reduction program that they're going to, like a safe injection site in the lab. So the client would bring the sample into the site. The site will collect it, send it to, there's 3 labs now affiliated with the hospitals in Toronto that will analyze the sample using, really sophisticated technology, send it back, and then that info is relayed to the client. Not only that, the info that's relayed to the client would then be made available to the broader community to say that, if you're in this east side of Toronto, there's, a bunch of purple powder stuff going around that could kill you, please be careful, that kind of a thing, a community message. So that's kind of how it all works. Now, in theory, that's how it should all work. The challenges here, I'm going to probably focus more on the backstage challenges. One is they can't do this without handling banned substances, right? So we have drug laws in Canada that pretty much says you can't be in possession of this stuff. Otherwise, you'll get arrested and thrown in prison. So the whole project actually needs to have approval from the Office of Controlled Substances. They pretty much have to create an exemption in the drug laws to allow this organization and my friend Karen to be able to handle this stuff. The second issue is the courier. So moving the samples around, they're going to have bike couriers do that. And the bike couriers were initially interested, and then until they realized what it was that they're going to be transporting, so they all said, no, we're not going to do this. This is crazy. It's too dangerous. This is not our business. And so that was one of the challenges that hamper the launch of this program, is not having the couriers. So this is my friend Karen. I had lunch with her last week at a cafe in downtown Toronto. She is Miss kind of do-it-all, from getting the exemption to designing. She's not a service designer, but clearly she is a service designer. So she pretty much, it's a one-woman show that put all of this together. And because of some of the trouble with courier, you see that backpack she's got there? I told her if she ever, so she's been the one running around transporting stuff. And I kind of said to her, if she's ever in an airport, the sniffer dogs are going to come after her for sure. But in this kind of a crisis, I think you have to find a way to bend, if not break some of the rules in order for some of this work to actually come to life. I think I'm just going to maybe leave it there. And just some key takeaways. One is, obviously, I think power and the power of institutions play a big role in this, particularly when it comes to drug use and the drug laws. We have drug laws in this country that would seem quite arbitrary. The very first drug law in this country is called the Opium Act, 1908. I think the first of its kind anywhere in the world. And the Opium Act was largely not created to actually discourage drug use. It was created as an anti-immigrant piece of policy. So it was in Vancouver, there was a riot in 1907 because the white Anglo-Canadians felt that the Chinese immigrants were taking over their job and being able to provide labor at a much cheaper cost. So there was a riot in Chinatown, and William Lyon Mackenzie was sent there to look into the situation and realized that a lot of the Chinese immigrants were frequenters of these opium dens. And as a way to kind of protect the labor force, the white labor force, they enacted the next year the Opium Act, mostly to make life harder for Chinese and Japanese immigrants. And over time, that drug law, and that was initially for heroin and things like that, over time, the next few decades, further drugs got added to this list, including marijuana, which, by the way, yay, decriminalized as of last year, right? Enjoy. But it's quite arbitrary what remains on that list, and so I think for a lot of people within this community, it would seem arbitrary that somehow they're being punished and criminalized for some things, and while others are not. So one of the takeaways is obviously, how do we design within the constructs of power dynamics and the institutions? I think also, how do we design in a way that's responsible, that reflects this community-based approach that I think the speaker at the end of yesterday spoke about. And that requires a lot of trust building with the community. That's not inviting them to come to your boardroom and throw up a bunch of sticky notes. It requires a lot of legwork. It requires actually you going out to them. So much of this work is actually us going out to the community. Them coming to you means they're coming into a place of power, right? You going to them, allows you to strip yourself of those power and to be on the same power sharing level with the people you kind of want to design for. So I think I'm just going to maybe stop there and just say that if you're interested, check out our website. Hashik mentioned this, Twitter, a nice way to connect with me and we can have a conversation, but thank you very much.